Good afternoon. Happy Monday. Welcome to another week of our DCO3O Cooperative Education course. My name is Kobe Flatt. We are currently on week 5 of our Term 1B radio schedule. Now, we have been slowly working our way through the curriculum material for creating opportunities through cooperative education course. We talked about how, because most of you are already in your placements, as in you have full-time jobs and you're working, and we're going to tack this on as a secondary credit for your OSSD. We are working through our last week of the in-class required hours, which means today we are going to review unions, explore the role of unions, determine the impact of unions, what they have on different aspects of work. Tomorrow we'll be looking at labor trends, and that will actually wrap up our content material for the IL booklets. We will go to the end of the week. We are going to be broadcasting Wednesday and Thursday, covering our culminating activity. So there's no exam in this course, but we're going to have that final project. So Wednesday, we're going to be reviewing elements and components necessary for successfully completing your digital portfolio. Thursday, we'll be investigating and practicing platforms to present your digital portfolio on. If you need more insight as to how to best complete your culminating activity, please be sure to tune in Wednesday and Thursday. Feel free to ask questions then if need be, but as always, you can reach out to me whenever. So we will be done broadcasting on air at the end of this week. Please be sure to be submitting your assignments and logging your hours, submitting those as you complete them. As previously mentioned, today we'll be looking at unions. We are going to cover what is a union, talking about collective agreements, reviewing strikes and lockouts, going back to the history of unions, covering the myths and realities surrounding unions. Lastly, we'll go over interview tips and tricks, because your final assignment for this portion is to interview both a union and a non-unionized worker. So I'll give you tips and tricks so that you can be successful in conducting those interviews. Let's start with unions. Some of the questions surrounding unions: what's going on? Where are my packages? Why aren't their demands being met? Why do we, the public, have to suffer? What is the point, and when will it end? This is specifically thinking of, because it's on a lot of our minds today, the Canada Post strike. We're going to get into what they're going through, what the processes are, to help us better understand some of these questions that we've just peeked at. I had to giggle at myself when I was making these slides, because I remember going our first week of DCO3O on air saying, oh, you can skip to Unit 5 and talk about unions now, because we've got one happening, and it might not be happening when we get to Unit 5. And here we are, Unit 5, and poor Canada Post is still on strike. So what is a union? A union is an organization of workers in an industry who come together to fight for better working conditions. Now, by being a union member, you get a say in how your workplace is run, such as the hours of work, the wages that are paid, the availability of benefits like health benefits, disability insurance, as well as working conditions. Thinking of safety standards. We spent a lot of time in this course looking at health and safety. We talked both about the physical health as well as the mental health. We looked at the different acts and policies in place to help us through work environments. We also did some online courses, so we are certified in much of it. Hopefully you have a better understanding of safety standards by this point. When we think unions, we think there is power in numbers. When people work together, often more gets accomplished. So the same is true when you approach it from a union standpoint. When people work together, they have more power. They have more power to ensure safety practices. They have more power to protect against unfair treatment. And they have more power to negotiate with. Together, they have a stronger voice. When we think unions and the work that we're trying to achieve, it often goes hand in hand with collective agreements. Unions work to achieve collective agreements with employers. Now, this is a written contract that sets out working conditions for all employees and employers to follow. Going back to those policies and procedures and acts that we were looking at earlier, if you work in a unionized environment, you must pay union dues, even if you choose not to be a member. Sorry, I was on the wrong slide. Thinking of the policies, procedures, the right to collective bargaining is guaranteed by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. That's where I was going with that. Sometimes, along with collective agreements and collective bargaining, we encounter grievances. Unions also represent union members in individual grievances or problems with employers. So a grievance is a formal complaint that workers can make if they think the employer is not following the rules in the collective agreement. If an employee is concerned about some aspect of working conditions and is unsure what to do, he or she can ask for assistance from a union representative. The union helps the worker to solve the problems. They talk to the employer, they try to fix the situation based on the rules in the collective agreement. Remember, it's a written contract that is between the employees and the employer. Now, if the issue can't be resolved through discussion, it might go to a neutral third party for a final decision. And that's going to bring us into collective bargaining and strikes and lockouts. Collective bargaining is the negotiating process that unions and employers use to arrive at an agreement. Achieving a new agreement or renewing an old agreement can take time. Let's be honest, we know that through our decision-making lesson that we did, that there are some decisions that just take longer. You can imagine how long some work environment-related issues might take, especially after all the health and safety that we covered. If the negotiation is too difficult and the parties cannot agree, then the employer, the union, or the Ontario Ministry of Labour can appoint a mediator to help them achieve their goal. That mediator is a neutral third party who steps in and acts as the middleman to say, all right, let's bring it down. This is what I'm hearing from you. What do you think? They try to put certain things into perspective because, as I'm sure we all know, if we are in a heated argument, the statement that the person we're arguing with might come across a certain tone in our minds because of how we're perceiving it. Maybe that's not how the other person meant, and then things escalate. So a mediator is a neutral third party, doesn't have any stakes in it, and just wants to say, now this is what I'm hearing, and it helps to bring things down to a base level. And here we have the right to collective bargaining is guaranteed by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In your IL booklet, it talks about collective bargaining process. There is a process that the union and the employers go through in order to discuss and agree on terms. Now, these could include things like wages, work hours, benefits, job safety, and other important aspects of the job. Here's how it works. First, we have preparation. Both the union and the employer prepare their list of demands and priorities. The union gathers input from the workers to understand what it is that they want or they need. Second, then it goes to negotiation. Representatives from the union and the employer meet to discuss their demands. They talk back and forth, trying to reach a compromise that both sides can agree on. Then we get to agreement. Once they agree on the terms, they write them down in a document called a collective agreement. This agreement is then signed by both parties and becomes the official rules that everyone must follow. Again, this would include things like wages, work hours, benefits, job safety. The fourth step is implementation. The terms of the agreement are put into action. Both the workers and the employer follow the rules set out in the collective agreement. The last step is monitoring. The union keeps an eye on how well the employer follows the agreement. If there are any problems, the union can step in to help fix them. Now, collective bargaining helps ensure that workers have a say in their working conditions and that their needs are taken into account. It creates a fairer and more balanced relationship between workers and employers. So what happens then when they're not being followed, when a collective agreement expires and it's time to renew? Things have come up about, we made it to sort of the end of that contract and now times are changing and we want to revisit. Two things can happen, and it is sort of the last line of defense, if you will. It's what happens when negotiations have failed, when the employer and the employees can't agree. One of two things can result. The first is a strike. A strike occurs when workers walk off the job. The purpose of a strike is to call an employer's attention to something the employees think is unfair at work and to address the problem through collective bargaining. This one is what we are currently hearing a lot about in the news, currently experiencing, in the sense that we have Canada Post currently on strike. There's an article from this morning posted on the website for National Post. The headline is Canada Post strike involving more than 55,000 workers has hit 25 days. So here we were back on November 18th talking about, oh, hey, what if Canada Post is still on strike? And 25 days later, they still are. The strike began November 14th. Federal mediation was put on hold nearly 2 weeks ago due to the sides being too far apart. I'm going to read the rest of the highlights in the article and then we'll jump into what that is. So here we have Canada Post strike involving more than 55,000 workers has hit 25 days. In a statement Sunday, so just yesterday, Canada Post says it is awaiting a formal response from the Canadian Union of Postal Workers to the proposal it submitted to the union on Friday. So then Friday's statement, the union said it was reviewing what Canada Post put forward and questioned when the mediation process will officially resume. The union said it is committed to returning to the bargaining table. The strike, which began November 14th, federal mediation was put on hold nearly 2 weeks ago due to the sides being too far apart. Calls for government intervention have been mounting from the business communities, but so far the government has said it's not stepping in. We're going to get into how and why they can do that in a little bit here. The federal government has intervened in other high-profile labor disputes recently, including the ports, using a controversial section of the law to get the labor board to order binding arbitration. So here, remembering that the purpose of a strike is to call an employer's attention to something that the employees think is unfair at work, and they want to address the problem. We talked about how if the negotiation is too difficult or the parties can't agree, then the employer, the union, or the Ontario Ministry of Labour can appoint a mediator, that middleman, that person to help sit down. Because this has been taking a while, they brought in a mediator who tried their hand at helping to negotiate between the two, but walked away because the sides were too far apart. I wanted to show if you are involved in a strike, there will be information from your union representative coming your way. For those of us on the other side now, ways to gain information. I have Canada Post's website up, and it specifically talks about the negotiations. Talks about negotiation updates. There is a disclaimer right on their website. Canada Post operations continue to be disrupted by CUPW, so that is their labor union. National strike. Mail and parcels are not being delivered at this time. Some post offices remain open with limited services. Here, if you scroll down, so we have sort of the latest, we have yesterday's update, but if you keep scrolling, you'll see that this started a long time ago. I'm trying to see why we can't view more updates. It's not reloading. So here we have in September already, going back to July 29th, they're in negotiations. September 20th, they continue to negotiate with the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, the CUPW, to reach new collective agreements. September 25th, Canada Post presents global offers to the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. October 7th, they receive counter proposals. October 15th, Canada Post and CUPW continue to negotiate. As conciliation ends, the cooling off period begins. Mediator is appointed on October 16th. October 25th, Canada Post continues to negotiate as a union announces strike mandate. So they've already been at it for quite some time. Then we have November 12th, Canada Post intends to continue operating as strike notices are received. November 14th, Canada Post will continue to operate, but customers should anticipate delays in the event of strike activity. Then November 15th, they announce national strike, which will cause service delays for Canadians. 10 days after that, on November 25th, negotiations continue with Canadian Union of Postal Workers as the company marks day 11 of the strike. And here we have the special mediator. Talks grind to a halt with no movement on changes required for Canada's Post future. Canada Post is considering its options to move negotiations forward as talks with Canadian Union of Postal Workers have ground to a halt on key issues critical to the corporation's future. You can always go through and click for further information that gives you the full breakdown of the headline. So that was November 26th. December 1st, Canada Post presents comprehensive framework to reignite talks and reach agreements. December 6th, parties exchange further proposals. December 7th, there's a statement from Canada Post. Canada Post is surprised by public comments made by CUPW regarding our counter-proposal, as we have made significant moves to close the gap on key issues like weekend delivery, pensions, and wages, and bring much-needed urgency to the discussion. Then yesterday, there was another statement from Canada Post. where they say they're waiting for a formal response to the proposals that they shared with the union through the mediator on Friday afternoon. Proposals include significant moves to close the gap on key issues. So again, reasons why people strike are hours. They have concerns with working weekends, weekend delivery, their pension, and their wages. I wanted to show that information because if you do just Google, there are a lot of articles out there. There are a lot of different sides to a story. There's two sides to a story, but then we also have people's perspective in how things are interpreted. We talk about how when we're angry, the way that we see things, the way that things seem to come across, whether it's intended that way or not, gets heated. So we wanted to talk about how it's true for a lot of what's happening. Now that's one side. The other side then is a lockout. So what's the difference between a strike and a lockout? Well, a lockout occurs when management stops employees from working. A lockout usually occurs because management is resisting employees' demands during contract renegotiation. Employees are barred from entering the workplace until they agree to terms. They actually lock the doors. They lock the employees out. One of the more popular lockout scenarios surrounds the famous National Hockey League, the NHL. There was a big, probably one of the better known incidences took place between the players and the admin, sort of, the big lockout of 2004. Now, it wasn't the NHL's first lockout, though, but it's the one that more people remember. In 1994 and 1995, there was a lockout. The main issue then was the salary cap. Management favored and players opposed. The lockout lasted from October 1st, 1994 to January 11th, 1995. 48 regular season games were lost, making the 53-game season the shortest in the NHL in more than half a century. The league's first commissioner, Gary Bettman, facing off against Goodenow, the outcome included a reduction of regular season games from 84 to 82, but on key issues such as free agency and salary caps, it was more or less a tie. The lockout created a lot of animosity between ownership and players, setting the stage for future troubles. Enter the year 2004. The NHL lockout 2004-2005 was the big one. They ended up canceling the entire season. For the first time since 1919, there was no Stanley Cup champion. This was also the first time in any major North American sport that an entire season had been canceled. A major disappointment to hockey fans around the world that led many to sour on the league. The main issue in 2004-2005 then was, again, the salary cap. Again, it was Bettman representing owners and Goodenow representing the NHLPA. Owners wanted a salary cap linked to revenues. The players did not want the link. Player salaries had become a serious issue. The NHL was paying a far higher than average 3/4 of league revenue on salaries. Several teams were on the brink of bankruptcy. After 310 days of lockout, an agreement was finally reached that lowered guaranteed salaries to 54% of total league revenues. More recently, in 2012, the NHL had another lockout. It started September 15th and ended January 6th, 2013. As a result of the lockout, the season was cut from 82 games down to 48 games. Once again, represented by Bettman, attempting to control player salaries through modifications to the salary cap, player contracts, arbitration, and free agency rules. An agreement was finally reached that mostly satisfied both sides, and the season was salvaged. Another important and well-known lockout was the Canadian National Railway. For those who aren't necessarily hockey fans, in an article by Toronto City News, posted August 22nd, 2024, Canada's two biggest railways were preparing to get trains running again after Ottawa said it would step in to end a bitter labor dispute. So here we read about the strike happening with Canada Post and how government stepped in, talking about the bigger issues, and they've intervened in other high-profile labor disputes. Here is a time when the Canadian National Railway says it ended its lockout of workers that began earlier that day. So that one was October 22nd, and they began immediately to work on a recovery plan. The company said it was still awaiting a formal order from the Canada Industrial Relations Board. It made the decision to speed up the recovery of the economy. They said it satisfied the labor conflict. It was disappointed. A negotiated deal could not be achieved. The announcement came after Labour Minister Stephen McKinnon stepped in to get trains moving again after an unprecedented lockout by the country's two largest rail companies. We talked about how there are policies and acts in order to protect people, but there are also certain laws that help to keep things going in a sense. So Labour Minister Stephen McKinnon used his powers under Section 107 of the Labour Code to ask the Canada Industrial Relations Board to impose final binding arbitration. He asked the board to order the railways to resume operations under the terms of the current collective agreement until the new deal was put in place. McKinnon said that the collective bargaining process is ultimately up to the companies and the Teamsters, Canada Rail Conference Union, but the lockout is affecting all Canadians. After months of increasingly bitter negotiations, shipments at Canada National Railway and Canadian Pacific Kansas City Limited ground to a halt as talks broke off. Both railways called for binding arbitration. The union rejected those calls. So there are a few incidences where lockouts have occurred as well as strikes. You might have been affected by one, you might have participated in one. I wanted to review the history of unions in Canada, which talks about long time ago, way back when, as Canada was growing, so did its need for skilled workers. Canada relied on people who could build the things that communities need, including housing, roads, and vehicles. When we talk history, we are talking job security, hours worked, and health. In the early days, workers had very little job security. You might show up one morning to a job site and they don't need you anymore. Goodbye, thanks for coming out. The workers' hours, they were forced to work long hours. There were rarely any breaks. It was get it done now, and if you have to stay, you will do so. Workers faced significant risk of on-the-job illness or injury. Employers had no obligation to provide a safe work environment. It was a huge concern, and in certain companies, organizations, industries, more than others. There's a labor movement timeline that has been created mainly to give an idea. It's obviously not all comprehensive or inclusive, but highlights a few of the incidences over the years. Starting with 1872, Toronto printers strike. One of the first attempts to introduce unions came in 1872 when printers in Toronto went on strike for a 9-hour day instead of the usual 11 or 12-hour workday. All of the strikers were arrested and charged with conspiracy because it was illegal for people to protest hours of work, wages, or employment conditions. Now, despite being found guilty, the printer stand resulted in many industries moving to 9-hour days and laws being changed to allow union members to organize legally and to improve workplace conditions. So here we have in 1883, the Trades and Labor Congress, a Canada-wide federation of trade union, is formed. In 1912-1914, the Great Coal Strike of Vancouver. During the 1900s, the labor movement continued to grow despite the fact that governments and employers discouraged union membership and discredited unions. Between 1919 and 1920, more than 1,500 strikes occurred, involving an estimated 375,000 workers. Which brings us to 1919, the Winnipeg General Strike. The largest strike in Canadian history was the Winnipeg General Strike of 1919. 30,000 unionized and non-unionized workers walked off the job to protest poor working conditions. The strike did not result in any major reforms, and labor unrest and dissatisfaction continued for many more years, which is why today we have the right to collective bargaining being guaranteed by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Canadian unions continue to represent the concerns of their members with regards to wages, benefits, working conditions, and job security. Now, again, thinking in the more recent years, just talking about today, Canada Post strike involves more than 55,000 workers, coming a long way from 1919. Just to mention a few of the others, 1932, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation is formed. This is the first socialist party in North America. 1956, Canadian Labour Congress is formed. In 1975, Grace Hartman becomes the first woman to head the Canadian Union of Public Employees, so also known as CUPE. 1978, there was a strike by Inco workers. Now, Inco was nickel smelters, and it lasted 9 months. In 1985, the Canadian Auto Workers Union gains independence from the American United Auto Workers Union. In 1998, 2 teens start a union at McDonald's in Squamish, BC. Jennifer Weeb, 17 at the time, and Tessa Lowinger, 16 at the time, tried to start a union at McDonald's in Squamish, BC. Their union was later decertified, which means that 40% of the membership said they no longer wanted to be represented by the union. But how they stepped up and implemented one was still something worth mentioning. Also in 1998, the Toronto Transit Commission workers abruptly walked off the job. The Ontario government deems the TTC an essential service and ended up ordering workers back to work. Essential service is work considered so important to the health and safety of Canadians, for example, policing and firefighting, that workers in those jobs are not allowed to strike. Taking some time now to discuss further the thoughts surrounding unions. You can find on various platforms various resources, myths versus realities surrounding unions, and although attitudes have changed, the value of unions is still being debated. This list of myth versus reality comes from Manitoba Building Trades. The first myth that they highlight is workers do not need unions anymore. Working conditions are good and workers earn fair wages. Thinking it's 2024 now, folks. Come on. The facts are that since workers first banded together to demand fair wages and working conditions, unions have set the standards that benefit all workers. Before unions, most people worked 12-hour days, 6 or 7 days a week. Children did dangerous work in factories, and paid sick leave was virtually non-existent. Today, workers enjoy benefits such as maternity leave, vacation pay, protection from discrimination in the workplace, things which unions fought for and won. However, there are still many improvements to be made. Employers continue to keep people in part-time jobs to avoid contributing to government benefits. Young people work without pay as interns without the protections that full-time employees enjoy. The government allows companies to pay temporary foreign workers less than Canadian workers. Unions play an important role in building and maintaining a fair and equitable Canadian workplace. Another myth that the Manitoba Building Trades has highlighted is that unions make companies less efficient and profitable. According to their fact sheet, unions know there are no good jobs without successful, profitable companies. Workers have a stake in their organization remaining competitive, and unions play an integral part in developing cutting-edge training to ensure that people work in a safe, productive environment. These are important factors that contribute to efficient, profitable, and highly competitive companies. What about the question, unions make it impossible for employers to fire incompetent workers? Their statement is that anyone can be hired. Anyone who can be hired can also be fired. But having no contract requires employers to keep workers who may be incompetent, lazy, or chronically absent. Unions work to ensure that employers have just cause for dismissing their employees. They also ensure that people are treated fairly in the workplace regardless of their race, gender, physical ability, or sexual orientation. Much of that we've covered in previous classes. The next myth surrounding non-union workers do not pay dues, yet still make the same money as unionized workers. Their response is, with a high demand for construction workers in Canada, it's true that employers are paying high hourly wages. Yet recent studies show that unionized workers continue to earn approximately $5 an hour more. Workers who do not belong to unions are often expected to work longer shifts for weeks at a time without earning overtime. They also rarely have access to benefits, such as dental insurance, extended health care coverage, legal insurance, or pensions. Another myth, people who do not want unions are often forced to join and pay dues. Their response is, when the majority of employees at a workplace vote in favor of unionization, those who are opposed do not have to join the union. They do, however, have to pay union dues. And although it may seem unfair, it's because unions negotiate contracts on behalf of all employees, not just those who voted for them. So when wages increase or benefits improve, everyone gets to partake. They all benefit from it. This structure is comparable to paying taxes. Taxes may seem unfair too, especially if you didn't vote for the party that forms the government. But we all benefit from the laws and services the government provides, and therefore we all have to pay in order to make them available. The last myth that we're going to address from buildingtrades.ca is unions only care about themselves and don't care about inconveniencing others by going on strike. Their response is that strikes make headlines and can be inconvenient for people, but the truth is today about 95% of labor agreements are successfully negotiated without strikes. No union actually wants a strike to happen, and no one is more inconvenienced by a strike than the workers themselves. Strikes happen when two sides cannot agree and workers believe the issues at stake are important enough to justify sacrifices. Unions have always worked to make gains that benefit the whole community. The labor movement fought for public health care and education, minimum wages, pay equity, sick pay, and pensions. So there are a few of the myths and realities that can be found online and would definitely have a different perspective depending on where you get it from. You are then in your IL booklet taken to a questionnaire assignment where you're going to use the forms provided to interview first, or it doesn't matter who comes first, but one, a union worker, and then a non-union worker. If you don't have a person to interview, we do have a pre-recorded interview conducted by the previous co-op teacher with an individual who was very kind to give their time and answers for us to use. You can go to that pre-recorded video, listen to the answers, and complete the form according to the responses given. So when asked what union do you belong to, you can just listen and fill in the answers. Next it says, are all employees in your company required to join the union? Kind of like what we just talked about. Has the union negotiated a collective agreement with a company? Have you ever been involved in a strike or a lockout? And you want to ask them to describe the situation. The pre-recorded interview has gone through that, so you can get those details. How do you feel about strikes in general? What was the outcome of the strike? What has the union done for you? Do you feel the services you receive from the union justify the dues you pay? Now, I wanted to bring up, if you are not going to use the pre-recorded video, I wanted to go over some tips and tricks for conducting an interview. Because some of these questions can be sensitive, you want to be mindful of how to approach it. You want to know how to elicit a descriptive answer by asking further questions. So if you ask, have you ever been involved in a strike or a lockout, and they say no, then done. If they say yes, done. You want a little bit more out of them. You want to get a more complete answer. So thinking of interviewing somebody, we want to note that interviews are a type of research. However, unlike reading a book or going online to do research, you're actually talking to a person. You are getting an original and primary source of information. You're getting it firsthand. If you would like to take the opportunity to discuss with somebody who might be striking right now that you know of, you could approach them. I've come up with 8 tips and tricks for interviewing an individual, and the first is securing a subject. You want to introduce yourself and explain how and why the interview will be used. We want to come across as open and from a learning perspective, a learning point of view, teach us more. Do some research. Step 2, or tip 2, look up background information. Don't go into it saying, I don't know anything, just let me know what you've got. You want to have some direction. Try to look up background information, see what you can find online, look at their company or organization specifically. Find out if you can determine when negotiations started and what the different steps were and what the processes were, how they got to be where they are now. Thirdly, you want to think of location. Where will you go to conduct the interview? You want to consider somewhere that has no background noise or disruptions. Then think of your questions. So tip 4, questions prepare open-ended questions to ask. Again, we want to get more out of them. Consider asking how, what, or why. Your subject then will give more detailed answers as opposed to close-ended, did you strike, and all they need to give then is a yes or no answer. Tip 5 is listen. Be a good listener. Focus on them. Don't be afraid to ask questions you haven't written out, but you come up with. They are sparked during conversation. If you're not focused on them, if you're not listening, you're going to miss some of those opportunities. You want to learn from them. You want to gain a better understanding of what they're going through, of what's happening, of what their opinions are. Another way to show that you're a good listener is by taking notes. Now, sometimes we can get caught up in trying to scribe word for word and it's not super efficient. So consider using a recording device. However, if you are going to record somebody, you must get their permission first. Ask if you can record them. Not just because you're being polite, but because by law you have to. You have to ask if it's okay to record them. Always remember to be polite and friendly. When you come at it from a place of learning, you are going to be more neutral and not so aggressive, hopefully, where they need to feel defensive. You want to establish a rapport so that they are comfortable and can give more answers and open up. Lastly, be sure to thank them. Thank them for their time. You can even consider sending a thank you card. That covers the union portion of our Unit 5. Please go to the assignment that is posted on our Google Classroom. Oops, I did Google Slides. Nope, we want Google Classroom. Show you where it is and how to find that pre-recorded interview, should that be more convenient than going out and finding somebody to interview. But I do encourage you, even if you only know a non-unionized worker, you can ask them these questions and then use the pre-recording for the unionized worker information. See if you can get both, but again, I understand it's not always easy, so you can use the interviews that are here. There is the link posted for the pre-recording. You can click that link to watch and answer the forms as you go. Be sure you're filling in the non-unionized worker interview questions into the non-unionized worker form. But you want to get that in, you want to get that completed, you want to get it sent off to me so that you can be fulfilling all of those assignments while you are completing your placement hours. Tomorrow we're going to go over labor market and labor trends to wrap up the IL booklet material, leaving Wednesday and Thursday to review the culminating activity requirements, components, and expectations. Thanks so much. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Drive safe.